Good evening. Let's sing together, Jesus Saves. We have heard the joyful sound, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Spread the tidings all around, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Bear the news to every land, climb the steeps and cross the waves. Onward 'tis our Lord's command, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Wafted on the rolling tide, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Tell to sinners far and wide, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Sing, ye islands of the sea, echo back, ye ocean caves. Earth shall keep her jubilee, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Sing above the battle strife, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. By his death and endless life, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Sing it softly through the gloom, when the heart for mercy craves. Sing in triumph o'er the tomb, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Give the winds a mighty voice, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Let the nations now rejoice, Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Shout salvation full and free, highest hills and deepest caves. This our song of victory, Jesus saves, Jesus saves.
Good evening. Ooh, I think I'm a little loud. Welcome back to our evening service tonight. Glad you are with us tonight. Let me give you just a couple of announcements that's not in your bulletin, and then one that is. Don't forget that the Weight Loss Challenge group will be meeting tonight following service. We'll be meeting in the Examples classroom, so just remember that. Also, men's softball, they are starting a sign-up list. And I've already discovered there's people on the list who didn't even know they had signed up. It's a miracle. So, if you're interested in playing softball, see Scotty. He can give you all the details. And so just remember that. And then also, this Wednesday will be Summer Splash for the kids. But we'll still have our regular adult service in here at 6:30. So feel free to come eat. We do need buns and chips for that, so if you can remember that. So come eat, and then adults will come up here for our adult Bible study. So just keep that in mind if you would. All right, let's have our ushers come forward, and we'll receive our evening offering. Also remember the camp has started, or getting ready to start, or underway, and remember the teens this week as they're at camp, and then just the following weeks as well. So, Brother Jamie, will you lead us?
Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and may you bless life, Lord. We thank you about
Sing, Come Thou Fount. Come Thou Fount of every blessing. Tune my heart to sing thy grace. Streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. Teach me some melodious sonnet, sung by flaming tongues above. Praise the mount I'm fixed upon it, mount of thy redeeming love. Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I come, and I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. Jesus sought me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God. He to rescue me from danger interposed his precious blood. Oh, to grace how great a debtor daily I'm constrained to be. Let thy grace, Lord, like a fetter, bind my wandering heart to thee. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart, Lord, take and seal it for thy courts above.
If you have your Bibles, be turning with me to the book of Daniel, chapter 5. Daniel, chapter 5. Enjoyed the service this morning. Hope you did. I know the Lord challenged my heart with some things, and so I appreciate all that Brother Dennis had to say this morning. Daniel chapter 5, we're going to try to work our way through the chapter tonight. Well, he should have seen the handwriting on the wall. How many of us have heard that statement? Yes? No? I think what I just got was some of the older ones have heard that, and some of the younger ones have not heard that. And so, what does that mean when we say the handwriting on the wall? Well, it usually means that they should have seen that the end was coming, or something to that effect anyway. Tonight, we're going to look in Daniel 5, which is famously entitled, I guess, the handwriting on the wall, the finger of God. And so we'll see that saying that we may or may not have heard of comes out of this particular chapter. And when you just think about that for a moment. How old this story is, this account, right? We're in the 500s BC era, and yet that phrase is still with us. It's quite amazing. So let me give us a little bit of background before we dive into the actual chapter to kind of hopefully bring us up to speed on where we are in the book of Daniel. Concerning chapter 5, David Jeremiah says this. He said, at this point, about 70 years have passed since Daniel was a captive as a teenager. And more than a quarter of a century has elapsed since the end of chapter 4. King Nebuchadnezzar has now been dead, or is now dead rather, and after a reign of 44 years, and Daniel would be in his early 80s. Okay, so that's kind of where we are. 25 years have passed since chapter 4, going into chapter 5. And what's interesting with Daniel, in particular chapter 5, is what we're going to see is chapter 5 is the end of Belshazzar. Okay, but when we get to chapter 8, we're going to be in the third year of the reign of Belshazzar. So it's not chronologically given here in the book of Daniel, but so we're going to kind of go back and forth as we work our way through the book. So I want to give us the kings of Babylon just real quick, just kind of mention them because it's important because of where we are in chapter 5, and with this particular king whose name that we'll see is named Belshazzar. Nebuchadnezzar reigned from 605 to 562 BC. After that was a family member by the name of Amel Marduk, who reigned from 562 to 560. Notice the shorter reign of these particular people. Neriglissar reigned from 560 to 556 BC. Labashi Marduk only reigned in 556, not even a year. Nabonidus, I had to work on that one. Nabonidus served from 556 to 539, and Belshazzar served from 553 to 539. And if you notice, those are together. And we'll see why here in just a second. John Walvoord explains it this way. He says, in this particular period that I just mentioned to you, a number of monarchs had succeeded Nebuchadnezzar. According to Berosus, Nebuchadnezzar was succeeded by that son, Evil Merodach, that's a good name, or Amel Marduk, depending on how they say it, who was killed in 560. And then he was followed by Neriglissar, a son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar, who died in 556 by natural causes. He was then succeeded by Labashi Marduk, a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, who was assassinated after less than a year. Nabonidus assumed the throne in 556 and reigned until 539, when he was conquered by the Medes and the Persians, and we'll see that in chapter 5. Belshazzar is best identified as his son, whose mother was either a wife or a daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, and thereby strengthening the claim of Nabonidus to the throne. And this explains why Belshazzar is in the lineal descent from Nebuchadnezzar and was honored as a co-ruler of Nabonidus, or however you pronounce his name, I forget now. But anyway, so the bottom line is there's a lineage there from Nebuchadnezzar down to this man by the name of Belshazzar. That's important as we go into the story, the account of the finger of God. And we're going to see that here in just a little bit. So let's dive into the chapter, verses 1 through 4. And it says this: King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods. Now catch this. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Now, just a little side note, it appears that they had like degrees of gods. You had gold and silver, who kind of was on the top of the pyramid, and then underneath that would have been the bronze, iron, wood, and stone gods. So to me, that was just kind of interesting that that's worded that way. So let's look at a couple of things here in these verses. First of all, we had the attendance in verse 1, that there was a great feast where 1,000 of his lords came. Now, the actual number that was in attendance at this particular banquet would have actually been not 1,000, but in the thousands. When they would hold feasts like this, they would have somewhere up to 15,000 people come to these parties. Can you imagine the guest list for that one? You know, are you on the guest list? And then they roll the scroll out so they can find out if your name is on the list or not. And here's what I came across this, that one particular king, it is recorded in history that he had 69,574 guests when they dedicated a new capital city in 879 BC. 69,000 people. Now, this particular festival that they were having was not your average festival. It was not a regular formal dinner that we see. For example, when our president goes to a formal dinner and they're all there and they're dressed nice and they it's just a very formal event, and the menu is picked out and that sort of thing. It was nothing like that. This was just simply a drunken party. That's all it was. Again, I wanted to quote David Jeremiah here because he does a really good job of describing what was going on. He says Belshazzar was not hosting a dignified royal state dinner, but again, it was a drunken party. King Belshazzar violated, now this is important, violated royal protocol by drinking with his lords and inviting women to the feast. In most ancient Near East cultures, men and women had very little public interaction with each other and were customarily separated on social occasions. When this protocol was violated, it usually meant that sensuality was involved. We see this in the Bible's explanation for why Xerxes violated custom and demanded that Queen Vashti leave the women's banquet to come to the men's party. Quote, Esther chapter 1, verse 11, he wanted the nobles and all the other men to gaze on her beauty, for she was a beautiful woman. So the idea is there's usually two separate parties going on. There's the men's party, and then there was the women's party. And the only time the women got to come over to the party was for sensual, sexual reasons. And so because he had these people there, more than likely this is what was happening. And then in verses 2 through 4, we read where the desecration of God's vessels. We saw that they brought out these vessels. When it says he tasted the wine, he wasn't just tasting the wine. He had had a lot of the wine. He wasn't feeling a lot at that moment when you dig into it. He was feeling good, right? So in his drunken stupor, as we would say, he decided that it would be a great idea to mock, and this is what happens in this when you read verses 2 through 4. It is a mocking of the one true living God. Because they took out the instruments that Nebuchadnezzar had taken in 605 BC. Remember, he brought those with him from Jerusalem, these vessels of God, and he brought them to Babylon, and there they sat, and all of a sudden Belshazzar thought it would be a good idea to bring those vessels out that have been designated for God and his use and to use them for his drunken party. And that's what they did. Now, I mentioned that Belshazzar knew that this was blasphemous. He knew this was wrong. And I want to point you to verse 13 and verse 22. And we'll come back to these verses later, but I want you to see this. He says in verse 13, Then Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king answered and said to Daniel, You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. So he understood who he was, and he understood who he was because his wife had reminded him, and we'll see that in verses 10 through 12 in just a second. And then verse 22, when Daniel is rebuking Belshazzar, this is what he says in verse 22, And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. Now, the all this is what the verses are prior to that where, and we'll see this, where Daniel gives a little history, a brief history of Nebuchadnezzar. And so he looks at Belshazzar and he says, You know what happened in Nebuchadnezzar's life. You know what God did in his life. And you ignored it. Okay, so we're going to come back to that in just a second. But Belshazzar knew exactly what he was doing. And he was ignoring the history, and he was doing it anyway. I love what the Wycliffe Bible Commentary said concerning this particular event in verses 2 through 4. You ready? It says this, It was stupid. That is straight to the point, isn't it? What he did, it was blasphemous, and it was just stupid. So why would you throw a party now? Because there were some things going on in Babylon. And what was going on in Babylon that very moment was the Medes and the Persians. They were literally outside the city gates. And he decides in that moment to throw a party. So was Belshazzar ignoring the threat of the Persians? Did he just think, now remember we had talked about how magnificent these walls were, how thick they were, how tall they were. So was he just thinking, hey, they may get to the gate, but they're not getting over the walls and they're not getting through the gate? Was he just that arrogant? Jeremiah prophesied that there would be a nation from the north that would come and they would conquer Babylon. And they even make mention of the fact that it would be the Medes and the Persians. I'll just give you the reference, Jeremiah 51 through 3 and verse 9 and Jeremiah 51, 11 and verse 28. So it's possible that Belshazzar thought that even if the Persians reached the city gates, they would not be able to get through those gates and get over those walls because they were so well built. So let's look at verses 5 through 9 in what we call the finger of God. Now remember, verse 4, they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, and they were drinking out of the vessels of God. Verse 5 says, let's just read verse 5 and then we're going to come to 6 through 9. Verse 5 says, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. This was literally the handwriting on the wall. Again, this is where we get that saying, a handwriting on the wall. It's as if a person, when we use this term, it's as if a person gets fired from a job and someone says, well, they should have seen the handwriting on the wall. And they say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, let's see. They were late all the time, and when they were showing up for work, they didn't even do their work. So they should have seen the handwriting on the wall that they were eventually going to get fired, right? They should have seen it. Well, here, Belshazzar literally saw the handwriting on the wall. God wrote a message to him. And we're going to see what that message is here in just a little bit. But this isn't the first time that we see God's finger write a message. One other time that is in Exodus 31, verse 18, where God was writing a message and he gave it to Moses. And Exodus 31, 18 says, and he gave to Moses, when he had finished speaking with him on Mount Sinai, the 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone, written with the finger of God. Now, if it's written with the finger of God, I think you can probably take it to the bank. It will come to pass that we need to pay attention to what's being said there. And Belshazzar is going to find that out in just a moment. Now, notice Belshazzar's reaction in verses 6 through 9. Verse 6 says, the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. His color changed. He turned as white as a sheet. Anybody here ever turned white as a sheet? I can remember a few years ago when we were living in Springfield, we had gone to the mall. I forget how old Emma would have been at that time. Needless to say, she didn't need to be alone in the mall, right? She's still that little that she didn't need to be alone in the mall. And we'd gone to the mall and we're there, and I don't know, somehow, there was times where like I would go in a certain store with 1 or 2 of the kids, and Holly may go, and then she may have 1 or 2 of the kids. You know how that works, right? Well, somehow we lost Emma. I mean, she was gone. And I am not joking, this is what I did when we discovered she was gone. I started walking through the main hall of the mall, screaming to the top of my lungs my daughter's name. Sounded like a good idea at the time. And I was freaking out because I had no idea where she was at. And as a dad, when your daughter's that small, regardless how old she is, in that moment, there was just all these awful thoughts that rush through your mind, right? So anyway, I'm walking through the mall screaming my daughter's name. Now, there's a point to this, and that is when I got to the little customer service desk, there was a lady that used to come to our church, and she came up to me, and she tapped me, and she says, Michael. And when I turned to her, she goes, what is wrong? And I was like, I can't find Emma. We can't find Emma anywhere. And I've walked through the mall, and I can't find her, and I'm screaming around, and we can't find her. And she's like trying to calm me down, and she said there was no color in my face. And thankfully, Emma had gone to another store, found an employee, and we still have her. But, so, the thing is, I get it when it says he turned white as a sheet. Now, it was out of fear, right? Not only did his color change, but we're told there in verse 6 that his thoughts alarmed him. Now, I want you to remember what's going on in the city, right? We got the Medes and the Persians who are just outside the city gates. He has just drank out of the vessels of God in mockery. Do you think maybe he had a couple of thoughts of maybe, I wonder if I've really made the God of the Jews mad by doing this? Or did he maybe have a thought of, can the Persians get in? Can they come over the gates? Can they come over the walls? His thoughts alarmed him. Not only that, verse 6 says his limbs gave way. His legs literally could not hold him up due to his fear. And then it says his knees knocked together. And as we all know, that is still a sign of great fear today. Boy, his party changed quick, didn't it? So not only did he have extreme fear, but then he's going to have what I called extreme rewards in verses 7 through 9. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple. That's a sign of royalty. And have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then the king Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. Extreme reward. So he calls his wise men in verse 7. And remember, he's kind of the co-leader during that time. And so he gives them the most he can give them, which is to be the third ruler of the kingdom. If you'll just give me what the interpretation is. And they couldn't do it. How many times have we seen through the book of Daniel already when men needed information and it was only God's man who could give them that information? His wise men in verse 8 had no answer. And then we see in verse 9 again that because they could not give him an answer, fear gripped his heart again. But then comes Daniel. Verses 10 through 12, we have the recommendation from the queen. Verse 10 says, the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet. Notice she wasn't in the party apparently at the time. She came into the banquet hall, and the queen declared, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. She saw it. There is a man in your kingdom in whom the spirit of the holy gods, in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show you the interpretation. So that's the recommendation from the queen. I find it interesting that she was the one that thought of it. Now, remember, Daniel's in his 80s. He doesn't have, by all indications, he's not like high up in the kingdom anymore. especially given the fact of who Belshazzar is and his philosophy and mentality and everything else. And so she thinks of Daniel. Now, 13 through 16, again, as rewards, he calls Daniel in before him, tells him, he says, "You are Daniel," in verse 13, "one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. I've heard that the spirit of the gods is in you." And then he goes through that and says, "Listen, I'll give you purple. I'll give you the third of the kingdom. I mean, the third ruler of the kingdom." He offers everything that he had offered to the other guys to Daniel. And then verse 17, Daniel refuses it. Now, the other people didn't. The magicians, the astrologers, enchanters, all those guys, their thought was, I could be the third guy in charge. But Daniel, in his godly wisdom, in verse 17, "Then Daniel answered and said before the king, Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation." Then comes what I call the rebuke. Because Daniel is about to lay it on thick to Belshazzar, the king. Now think about this. Daniel has been called into this banquet. Daniel has been faithful to God through different kings. His life's been on the line. He was found faithful. God delivered, all sorts of things. He is in his 80s, and he walks into this banquet, and what do you think's the first thing he notices? It's the vessels of God being used in a drunken party. So to me, he walks in and he sees that and he's like, "King, you can keep your stuff and you can keep your position, and I'll give you the interpretation." Now, he gives them the rebuke before he gives the interpretation. Look at what he says in verse 18. 18 through 21, he gives a little history of Nebuchadnezzar. He says, "O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive, and whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened, so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will." And then he looks at Belshazzar in verse 22, and he says, And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this." He knew the history. He knew that God was real because he had seen God work in Nebuchadnezzar's life, how he had humbled Nebuchadnezzar. And yet he still lived the life that he did. And really, again, I just want us to get a hold of the fact that he was mocking the true and living God by doing what he did. In verse 23, he says, "But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords and your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you praised the gods of silver and of gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which did not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath and whose are all your ways, you have not honored." So he had a haughty spirit, as we would say. So he gives them that's a rebuke, right? Now, and the other thing I keep in mind is he's in his 80s, right? He's probably at that point where he's like, "What are you going to do to me?" Right? I'm in my 80s. I mean, what really can you do to me? I like that. We need to kind of have that mentality, all of us. What's the worst the world's going to do to us? If they kill us, we're with Jesus. Then comes the revelation in verses 24 through 28, the interpretation. 24 and 25 says, Then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed, Mene, Mene, Tekel, or Tekel, and Upharsin, or Pharsin, depending on your translation. This is verse 26, this is the interpretation of the matter. We'll get into that in just a second. Now, these words are words of Aramaic, and each one has a significant meaning. The word Mene it's given twice, and from my understanding, it was given twice for emphasis, and it means it has been numbered. Verse 26, this is the interpretation of the matter, Mene. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Verse 27 tells us what Tekel is. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. In verse 28, now yours probably says Peres, P-E-R-E-S, where it says Upharsin. In verse 26, it's the same thing. It's just another way, another form of saying the exact same word. Verse 28 says, Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So the idea is simply this. Daniel looks at Belshazzar and says, God has judged you, and your kingdom is done, and your rule and reign is over. Now here's what's fascinating, is verse 29 to me. Because Belshazzar decides to actually keep his word for maybe once, I don't know, but he kept his word. Verse 29 says, Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler of the kingdom. Why did he do that? Why would he decide to honor his word to a man who just told him, your kingdom is over. Your reign as king is finished? My personal opinion is I think he was trying to appease God. I think it was his one last dash effort to make amends for what he had done. But it was meaningless. By the way, just like all of our works to try to appease God, right, without Christ, is meaningless. (30 and 31) says, that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Belshazzar's kingdom falls that very night. Do you know why? Because God's word is always true. Always. So what does this mean for us? Because we're not living in 539 BC. What does it mean for us? Let me give you just a couple of ideas. One main thing and then some things underneath it is this. Number one, do not profane that which is sacred. And that's believer and non-believer. What do I mean by that? Let me give you an example that I find that we see, I think, even in the New Testament. In Acts chapter 5, we have the account of Ananias and Sapphira, right? We know that story. We know that account. The problem was they lied. They said, we've sold a piece of land and we've brought the proceeds to give to the apostles so that they may distribute those to those who have a need. That's kind of the way they were working in that early church. You read that in Acts chapter 2, that's how it was kind of set up, and that's what they were doing. But the problem was they lied about the amount. And they didn't just, when you read Acts 5, it wasn't the fact that they lied to Peter, because Peter calls them out on it. And he says, you've not just lied to me, you've lied to the Holy Spirit. And God killed them on the spot. One died, they buried them. A few minutes later or some time passed, the other one comes in, and they die. And the second person, the wife, was given a chance, right? Remember? She was given a chance. Was this what you sold it for? Is this what you... And she's, oh, yeah. And they're like, well, guess what? You get to join your husband today. And she died. We do not take lightly the things of God. And it's so easy to do because we don't see people getting struck by lightning today. We don't see them lie about an offering that they're giving and they just drop dead. And so because we don't see those things, we can sometimes take the things of God lightly. And it's a dangerous thing. It is. As Christians, we do not take lightly His Word, and we do not take lightly His service, whether it is this service or it is our service for Him. We should never take it lightly. For the church, that means what we do and how we do it matters. Right? Not only what we do, but how we do it really does matter. So that means everything we do in honor of Him, to give Him the glory and the praise and the honor that is due His name. Now, I'm not going to go into, I'm not going to go into detail. Well, you can't do this and you can do that and all that kind of stuff in service. That's not my point. My point is everything we do, regardless of what that is, it needs to. It matters. It just matters. Listen, there's things that go on, and I'll hurry. I've tried to cut back on Christian TV because it's bad. It's really bad out there. There are things going on in quote-unquote Christian church services that is just downright, in my opinion, would just be blasphemous. And that happens when we take the things of God lightly. And we don't take His Word seriously. And we think we have to look like the world in order to win the world. And when we think we have to look like the world to win the world, then in my opinion, I think we take away God's power of who He is and what He can really do. So if we're going to learn anything from Belshazzar, let us not profane that which is sacred in anything that we do. Not only as a church, but as individuals, as families. Let us do all to His glory. And that means we do things within the parameters of Scripture, of what He's revealed to us. So let us learn from Belshazzar on what not to do, right? Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for this evening. We thank you for your word, as always. Lord, I thank you that you are concerned with how we do things as a church. You are concerned of how we conduct business, that you are concerned in how we worship, you are concerned in how we serve. And so, Lord, I pray that we will always be a people at Fulton Free Will Baptist Church that does things in accordance with your word, for your honor and for your glory. May we never do things out of pride. May we never do things to be seen. May we always keep a humble heart before you. We give you glory. We give you praise.